Um, Hello again, everyone. Thank you for those of you who've come over from our previous session to join us in this one, and hello to new people who've joined us for the second of our British Science Week lecture series around the theme for British Science Week, which is Innovating for the Future. So we have the pleasure today to have Dr. Mike Hughes, who's from the Applied Optics Group in the School of Physical Sciences here at Kent, here to talk to us about how to shrink your microscope, amongst other things. I'll pass over to Mike in a second, but please do, if you have any questions as things go through, put your questions in the Q&A box down below, or the chat box if you prefer. I don't mind. I will pick these up at the end and I will pose these questions to Mike and for any further conversation at the end. But for now, over to Mike. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thanks very much, Rob, and thanks to you and the team for organising these events and inviting me to come and give a talk. And thanks to all of you for coming along. So as Rob said, my name is Mike Hughes. I lecture in physics, so I teach on our undergraduate programme at Kent. And I'm a member of the Applied Optics Research Group, which is a group of people who are interested in building imaging technologies using light, essentially. So we want to make useful instruments that allow us to get images, mostly medical images, but we also do some non-destructive testing and these kinds of things. Today, I want to talk to you about microscopes. And I want to make the case that the kind of microscopes that you may have seen before, you know, these big things which kind of sit there on a bench in a laboratory, are great and they're useful and they're in fact essential scientific tools. But they're not the right instrument for everything that we might want to do with a microscope. So I'm going to make the case that we can try to reimagine the microscope a bit, to see how we could redesign a microscope to allow us to get high resolution images, so images of very small things, in places where we couldn't take a microscope normally, to be able to see things that we couldn't normally see with a microscope. So let's start by having a look at a picture of a microscope. Okay, so this is the kind of microscope that you may have seen. You perhaps used one at school. You may even have one at home. It's a very simple kind of microscope called a transmission microscope. So the thing that we want to look at, what we call the sample, is sitting on this piece of glass, okay, called a microscope slide. So it could be some cells, for example. Underneath, we have a light source. So it could be a lamp, an LED, which is going to shine some light through this sample. The sample may absorb some of that light, or some of that light may pass through. Then just on top of the sample, so maybe a couple of millimeters above it, we have something called a microscope objective. This is basically a lens or a group of lenses. And this is a thing that's doing the real job of the microscope. So this is the arrangement of lenses, the optics, that's going to produce a magnified image of our sample. And then up at the top, we may have an eyepiece, so we can look directly at that image, particularly if it's an old-fashioned microscope or maybe a child's microscope. Or often in a modern microscope, we will have a camera here. So we'll capture an image on a camera, and then we'll look at that image on a screen instead. Now, this kind of microscope, even though it's really the simplest kind of microscope we can imagine, is still very, very widely used in lots of different applications. Perhaps one of the most common is in something called histology. So if you've ever, or you know anyone who's ever gone to have a biopsy taken at a hospital, you'll know that what the clinician does is they remove a very small amount of tissue, or perhaps a few small amounts of tissue from the body. And then they take away, they process it, and you end up with an image that looks something like this. So this is an example of a slide from a biopsy. I think this one's from a small intestine. And what they've done here is that they've taken that piece of tissue, they've sliced it very thinly, and then they've stained it with some stains. That's why you can see things that are pink and purple, right? Colours which our tissue isn't normally. And then often they will have looked at it under a microscope, just like the one I've just shown you. Okay, so they will actually look into the microscope, and it's an arrangement where you shine some light through and you have a microscope objective, an eyepiece, and they use that to make diagnosis. it's useful to think, whenever if we want to design a microscope, if we wanted to build a microscope to do something useful, we need to think, well, what do we want a microscope to do? What do we hope to achieve? Why do we look at something under a microscope rather than just sort of holding it up to our eye and taking a look at it? Well, the most obvious thing is what we call resolution, the ability to see small things. Now, a microscope allows us to see very small, very closely spaced objects, down to around about a micron, which is a thousandth of a millimeter in size. So that's the kind of scales we're talking about when we talk about a microscope. And of course, the smaller our microscope can see, okay, so that what we say is the better the resolution of our microscope is, then generally the better the microscope is, the more useful that microscope is going to be. So we want our microscope to have good resolution. We want to be able to see small things. But that's not quite the whole story. We also care about something that we call contrast. So it's not just that we want to be able to see small things, it's actually what we want to be able to see anything at all. Because it turns out if you took a cell and you perhaps put that in water and you put it on a microscope slide, actually you wouldn't see very much at all, because a cell doesn't absorb very much light. So the cell looks pretty much like the water that it's sitting in. So you wouldn't have very good contrast in that image. You wouldn't really be able to see the interesting things about the cell that you might want to look at. So in most modern microscopes, we have other ways of introducing contrast. Now, I've talked already for the example of histology, biopsy, where they apply these colored stains to the sample. These stains bind to different features that we're about seeing in the sample. And so they produce this much more colorful image where we can identify different things, different parts of the image by color. But there are lots of other contrast mechanisms, these different ways of improving the visibility of the image. One of the most common is something called fluorescence. Fluorescence is a phenomenon where there are certain molecules that if we shine light on them of a certain color, a certain wavelength, they emit, so they send back light of a different color or a different wavelength. And by taking these molecules and by causing them to bind, to attach to different features within the thing we're trying to look at, we can basically end up with a color-coded image, okay, by selectively imaging these things that we call fluorophores, these molecules that only emit light at certain wavelengths. We can basically get a color-coded image that allows us to see different parts of the sample very, very clearly. And there are lots of other techniques, such as confocal microscopy, which is all about allowing us to look at very thick samples. So we don't need to slice our sample into thin slices. Look at it under a microscope. We can take a thick bit of tissue, and we can look at that under a microscope. And there are lots of other related ideas. Now the problem is when you start to introduce all these different contrast mechanisms, when you want to make your microscope high resolution, when you want to be able to take your sample and position it very, very accurately within the field of view of the microscope, what you end up with is something that's very large, that's very complicated, and that's very expensive. And by very expensive, we really are talking tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pounds for the best microscopes. Now, maybe that's okay if you have a nice research laboratory and you're going to buy one of these microscopes, and then lots of scientists are going to come in and use it for specific studies. But it really does limit what we can do with the microscope. First of all, we clearly can't carry this huge thing around with us. So anything we want to image, we have to be able to take to the lab. And it also means that in any situation where you don't have lots of money to spend, then you can't do this kind of microscopy at all. So this is why I'm making the case that it would be a really, really useful thing if we could take the features of these large, expensive microscopes, and we could make small, compact, lower cost microscopes that can allow us to do, in some sense, the same things. So this is really the nub of my argument. Why do we want to shrink the microscope? Well, the first possible application is in education. Now, For most children, at least in the UK, a small, cheap hobby microscope might be affordable. But certainly they're not going to be able to afford the kinds of microscopes that I've just shown on the previous slide. And even a large school wouldn't be able to afford a very high-end microscope. But imagine if every child in the world was to have a microscope that could allow them to explore the microscopic world in a way that you can only do with a microscope that has some of these higher-end features. What a difference that would make to education and to their ability to get interested in science and biology and related fields. The second area, which is perhaps a bit related to this, is what I call frugality. The way we do microscopy in healthcare, certainly in a rich, developed country like ours, works pretty well because the clinicians will take a biopsy, a piece of tissue, and they will send it off to a laboratory, and those studies are done using the high-end microscopes in that lab. But of course, that isn't the case everywhere in the world. So there are plenty of parts of the world where access to these high-quality microscopes simply isn't available. So if we can make a smaller and a cheaper version of these microscopes, then there's a huge potential benefit to people who don't have the resources to access these expensive laboratory machines. The third advantage is something I've alluded to already. It's the idea that traditionally, if we want to look at something under a microscope, we have to go out, we get that thing, and we bring it to the lab, and we prepare it in some way, and then we put it under the microscope, and we get to see it. But there are lots of occasions where that's not really the workflow that you would want, right? You don't really want to have to take something, transport it to a lab to be able to look at it. You'd like to be able to take your microscope to the thing that you want to look at it right there. And then the final advantage, which is really related to this idea of imaging in the field, is that there are occasions when we want to get images quickly. Going back to the example of biopsy again, a clinician may remove some tissue from a patient, send it off to the lab. It may be a couple of days until the doctor who looks at those in the lab, the pathologist, actually gets to he goes through all the processing steps. They actually look at that sample and they write a report and they send it back to the original referring clinician. Now, in lots of cases, maybe that doesn't matter, but there's other cases in healthcare where that really does matter. For example, if you would like to maybe use some microscopic imaging to guide your surgery, clearly what you can't do is make your incision, take out a bit of tissue, wait 2 days, and then carry on with your surgery. So again, if we could have a microscope that we could use right there and then with the patient, giving us images immediately, real-time imaging, there are many more applications for microscopy that at the moment aren't really possible. So I want to show you some examples of work that people have been doing in order to try to shrink these microscopes, to make them more accessible, more usable in all these different places. So the first one is an example really from the education field. So this is something called a Foldscope, created by Foldscope, a company basically set up to produce the cheapest possible microscope they could for educational purposes. And they basically came up with a microscope that is essentially a folded piece of paper and a very cheap lens. And by folding a piece of paper in a very clever way, they can actually make a microscope where you can position your sample very accurately underneath that lens and get a reasonably high quality microscope image on a whole mechanical setup that costs pence to produce. This is another example from the Fletcher lab at the University of California in Berkeley. This is a microscope that's designed to work with your mobile phone. So the idea is that instead of having to have a microscope with a built-in camera and some built-in processing unit that can take those images and display them to you, you bring along your mobile phone, you attach it to this device, which has some low-cost optics in it, and you're able to get a high-quality microscope image and view it directly there on your phone. A final example from something that's been developed really recently. This is a machine that allows you to image water. And in particular, it allows you to image things that are inside the water. And it's a portable microscope in the sense that, you could go down to some water, the sea or a river, some area of water that you want to monitor the quality of, or maybe to see the microorganisms that are living in that water. And you put it there next to the water and you start pumping water through and you see real-time microscopy images in the field. So you can see there are, these are just 3 examples from a huge range of devices that people are trying to come up with, allowing us to shrink the microscope and to take it out and use it in places where it would be really impractical to use a traditional microscope. This is something that's really taken off in the last few years. And I want to suggest some of the reasons why it's taking off now. What are the technological changes that are really allowing us to do this? The first is improvements in hardware. So in the last few years, the cost of the light sources for microscopes has gone down hugely. So we can now get very high power LEDs, pence really, low cost lasers that only cost a few pounds. The really big one is cameras. Like, it's not so long ago that you had to spend a lot of money if you wanted a camera with millions of pixels. And now we all carry very, very high resolution cameras around in our pockets and our smartphones. And that's really driven a step change in the technology. You can have a very small, very high quality camera, and the cost to produce that is a few pounds. The other thing that's happening is what we call additive manufacturing or 3D printing. If you want to go and make something now, you don't have to make a design and send it and do all the tooling for a large production run. You can make a small number of something using 3D printing. And that's really opened up possibilities for people to make small numbers of devices and to try them out in the field. On the previous slide, I showed you the example of a microscope that worked around a mobile phone. So it used the camera and the screen of the mobile phone to acquire images. And actually, it's mobile phone technology again, which is really driving a lot of the developments in our low-cost portable microscopes. Primarily because what we're now doing is we're carrying around a computer in our pocket, a very high-powered computer by any other than the most recent historical standards. And that means we can do all kinds of processing in our images right there on our smartphone. We don't need a large computer off in a lab somewhere. And of course, it also gives us communications. So if you have a microscope which is built around a smartphone and you take an image with that camera, or you don't need to carry that image back for somebody else to analyze, you can send it over the air. And that's really quite important because even if we take a microscope somewhere, we may not take the expertise needed to understand those microscopy images with the microscope, but that doesn't matter if we can just send those images straight back to that person sitting in their office. And the final thing, which is really starting to take off now, are developments in image processing, and particularly in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And really that has 2 quite big impacts. Firstly, it's meant that while traditionally, if you wanted to make a good microscope, you had to have really good optics. Okay, you had to have a really high quality set of lenses in order to get a good image. And it turns out now that's not quite the case anymore. You can take, in certain circumstances anyway, you can take a low quality image and you can process that image in such a way that you end up with a high quality image. And it's developments in machine learning that are really driving that forwards. And we're going to see a lot more of this in the next few years. The other way that machine learning is impacting is in the understanding, the reading, if you like, of the images that we get on the microscope. So again, if you want to take a microscope out to some remote location to do some diagnosis, probably you can't take the pathologist, right? The expert, the doctor who's an expert in reading those microscopy images out with you. But maybe that doesn't matter if you can make your computer, which you carry around in your pocket as part of your smartphone, do the diagnosis for you. Or at least do part of that diagnosis to simplify the images so that you can do the final step of understanding what they mean. So all of these things taken together have really driven this huge drive towards small portable microscopes. And I think they're going to carry on doing that for quite a few years yet. So for the last 10 minutes, I want to tell you a bit about what we're doing at Kent in this area, and in particular, the research that I'm carrying out. I'm mostly interested in developing fiber optic microscopes. So this is really another level of miniaturization below what I've been talking about so far. So far, the microscopes that I've shown you, they're smaller than a big microscope in a lab, but they're still things, you'd have to sort of put in a box and carry around with you. They're still microscopes where you have to take the sample and you have to put it in the microscope in order to see what that sample looks like. I'm interested in developing microscopes that sit on the end of an optical fiber. So a very thin, flexible microscope, maybe 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter, that you can put inside things that you want to get microscopy images of. And in the most case, that means putting them inside of people. Now, you still have some big bits in the microscope, right? So you still have some lenses and optics and lasers and things, and you still need that in a box somewhere. But your thin, flexible microscope is now attached to that box. So that box sits outside of whatever it is you want to look at, and you take your thin, flexible microscope and you put that inside the patient or whatever it is. So I think most of you are familiar, or at least seen, fiber optics at some point in your life. You may have had a Christmas tree or a toy that you get at the bonfire night, where you have what looks like some very thin pieces of plastic or glass, and you put one end of the thin piece of plastic or glass against a light source, like an LED, and then the light is somehow transported along the piece of glass, the fiber, and we get a dot of light at the other end. So these are really nice, and you can make pretty displays with these. And they're also absolutely vital for modern communications. So a lot of you will have fiber optic broadband. So what you have is instead of some electrical cables sending your internet signals, you actually have a fiber optic cable which is transporting light. And if you want to encode whatever internet website you want to look at in this fiber optic cable, then you just turn on and off your light very, very quickly and send that in a form of code through your fiber optic. So we have these fibers everywhere, but perhaps it's not obvious how we could use them to make a microscope necessarily. Okay, these fibers that we use for communications or for pretty decorations on our trees, it's not obvious how we send an image through those fibers. One way we can do it is using something called a fiber bundle. And what a fiber bundle is well, we take lots and lots of these fibers and we make them very, very small, a few thousandth of a millimeter in diameter, and we put them all together into this thing we call a bundle. And the image you can see here is one end of this bundle. And if we zoom into a small area, you can see each of these little fibers very, very closely packed, a few thousandth of a millimeter, a few microns spacing between them. This bundle of fibers is now able to act as something we call an image conduit, which means if we have an image at one end of this fiber, it will be transported through the fiber to the other end, with each of these little fibers within the bundle acting like a pixel on a camera. And then we can take this fiber bundle, this bundle of fibers, and we can put it, for example, inside an endoscope. Okay, so this is an endoscope that a doctor may use, for example, to look inside your esophagus or your stomach. This endoscope has a camera, which is the image that the doctor normally sees. And it also has essentially a thin empty channel. And through that thin empty channel, we can pass one of these bundles of fibers. And you can see it poking out at the end of the endoscope here. And then what we do is we push that thin bundle of fibers against a piece of tissue that we'd like to get a microscope image of. An image of that tissue is transported along the fiber. The fiber goes out of the patient into a box where we have some other optics, and we obtain microscopy images. Well, why do we want to do this? Well, as I said already, the traditional way that we see things inside, if we want to look at some tissue in a patient, the way we have to do that is we have to take that bit of tissue outside of the patient. So we have to take a biopsy, we remove it, and we process it, we have to slice it, we have to stain it. And then in the end, we look at it under a microscope. And as I've already said, that takes a long time. That takes a few days usually. What we're talking about doing here is now we have a microscope that we put inside the patient, and we see that microscope image immediately. Okay, it's like a video that we see from inside the patient. So now we can do potentially diagnosis on the spot, or we can use it to guide some of the procedures that we're doing. And this technology exists. Okay, it's been developed, it's been commercialized. And the work I'm doing at Kent is to really try to improve this technology a little bit further. We're working on various different things. One of which is to try to make this even lower cost, and also to improve the speed. So you want to be able to get images with a very high frame rate. Okay, so videos that look really crisp, so you don't see any sort of staggered images as you move your probe around. We're trying to shrink these microscopes even further so that we can put them inside a needle. And we're also trying to do something called holographic microscopy, which I will talk about in my last couple of minutes. This is an example of what these videos of microscopy images look like from the systems we're developing here at Kent. So here we're taking the end of our fiber, we're drawing it over a sample, which in this case is just a piece of tissue paper, and we're capturing these high resolution microscopy images from this device that's only 1 millimeter in diameter. And because this is a high-speed system, because we collect these images very quickly, we're able to stitch together these images as the probe moves and build up these larger images of the sample that we want to look at. We're trying to shrink them, we're trying to put them inside needles. This is very basic research at the moment. We're nowhere near doing this as a medical device on patients, but we have started to show that we can collect images through a fiber that's just 50 microns, so 50,000th of a millimeter in diameter. And the final thing we're doing is a type of imaging called holographic microscopy. In holographic microscopy, rather than pushing the fiber bundle right against the thing that we want to look at, we leave a small gap. So the object is no longer in focus, and we get an image that looks something like this, which is really unclear. It's not at all obvious what we're looking at there at all. But if we set up the imaging in just the right way, it turns out that what we're looking at here is not just a blurred version of the thing that we want to look at, it's actually a hologram of it. And if you look very carefully, you can see these sort of lines of light and dark surrounding the features in the image. This is an interference pattern. If we do some cleaning up of the image, what we can then do is take this hologram that we've acquired, right? So we had the sample, we took this hologram, and now in the computer, we can refocus this hologram. So we can actually get a high quality image of the object as though it was in focus. And you can see here as we focus into the sample, it gradually comes into focus, and now we can start to see the object that we're looking at. In fact, it was a test target which has these small arrangements of lines and numbers on. And this is potentially hugely powerful because it means we don't now need to worry about getting our sample in focus, which is something that's quite hard to do, with a very small, flexible microscope. Here, for example, we dip this into some pond water, and on the left you can see the hologram, on the right a refocused image. And what we're able to do is track a small critter that was moving around in the pond. We're able to track it in 3D. We're not doing any mechanical focusing, we're not moving the fiber around. Simply from this one hologram, we can refocus in depth and follow this creature as it moves around in 3D. So this is the kind of things that we can now start to do on the tip of a fiber, which is only perhaps a millimeter in diameter. So it really is the ultimate in shrinking your microscope. We're not talking about now something that you can maybe carry around in a bag. We're talking about something that you can sort of pinch between your thumb and forefinger. So I hope that I've given you a sense of what's possible, the kind of innovation that's going on generally and specifically at Kent in this field of making miniature microscopes. And I hope I've convinced you that it's an interesting thing to do, that it's a fun thing to do, but mostly that it's a thing to do which is going to have impact and that potentially could change many people's lives in education and also in healthcare. So thank you very much for listening. And if Rob has collected questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm clapping on behalf of the audience who can't clap, but I'm sure they're clapping at home. Please do bring in questions as they come to you, but I have got a couple of questions to kick us off here, but please, anyone else in the audience, please post any questions you'd like me to pose to Mike. I'd like to actually pick up at the end there, the kind of you were talking about these cool kind of things you're doing with the 50 micron fibers and even the holographic things. Kind of, obviously I appreciate they're in development at the moment, but when they get to the stage of kind of actually being able to be used, potentially delivered into the real world, what are the kind of applications that exciting applications we can see for some of these kind of things, for the fibers, for the holographic stuff, things like that?
So, well, let's start with the fibers. So the key applications of fiber microscopes in general are for rapid diagnosis and also to some extent for surgical guidance. So let's think of a condition, for example, something like Barrett's esophagus. So this is a condition where essentially there are changes in the esophagus, essentially cellular changes in the structure of the esophagus. And it's a risk factor for cancer. So if you have this condition of Barrett's esophagus, then what will happen is that you will occasionally go in and you'll essentially an endoscope will be put into you, and the doctor will take some biopsies, so some small amounts of tissue from a few select locations in the esophagus, and they will look at those in the way that I talked about in the lab. The idea what we could do with a fiber microscope is that you could, first of all, you could see those images straight away, right? So you wouldn't have to wait for the results. But perhaps more importantly, you wouldn't have to just take a few small samples, but you could actually move this fiber around, and you could check many more places, potential early signs of cancer. And there are lots of these kinds of applications for all different medical conditions where you want to be able to look in lots of places rather than just a few limited places, and where you'd really like to get that information quite quickly. And lots of people are working on devices for this, and there are devices available now that will allow you to do this. Needle microscopes are really quite a bit further away from commercialization, so there's no company making these, at least not for human use. This really comes down to the limitation of fiber microscopes in general, is that you can touch the surface of something, but you can't see what's underneath that surface, which is a bit different. When you take a biopsy, you can maybe you can put in a needle and you can pull out some cells from below the surface. And we can't really do the same thing with a fiber microscope. So the idea there is that you can penetrate into the tissue. But of course, you want to cause as little damage as possible when doing that. So you want your needle to be as small as possible, which means that you want your fiber to be as small as possible as well. And then finally, on the holographic fiber microscope, I don't know the applications that are going to be yet. It's something we're playing around with because we think it's interesting, and it's a fun and it's a cool thing to play around with in a lab. We know we can see interesting things with it, right? We know we could dip this in some water and we could see plankton swimming around in the water. We could potentially attach it to devices where we have objects in flow. It's a sort of convenient, flexible device that we could plug in, and we could see those objects in flow. I wouldn't like to be too specific about what those applications are going to be, because at the moment it's something that we've only got working in the last few months, and we're still trying to explore where that might go.
That's fair enough. Thank you. I mean, they're all really interesting areas and things to be looking at. Thinking, I want to pick up with the next question, which is even more forward thinking, but where would you, not what you're doing now, but where would you imagine or hope that we could be in the near future for some of these things? Are we talking like truly implantable microscopes? Are we talking, I don't know, something that's smaller, even thinner and smaller? Where would you hope we would be in whatever 50 years time in terms of microscopy?
Implantable microscopes, definitely. I think that's very close to being possible now, actually. I mean, there's issues with, power and communications and things like that. But I think we're really not too far away, at least in principle. We can imagine how that could be possible, even if we can't make those devices right now. As I talked about a bit earlier on, I think the thing that's going to really make a difference, certainly over the next 10 or 20 years, is the way that we handle the data that's coming from the microscopes, that allows us to think about building microscopes in different ways. Once we get away from, we need to produce this image that we can immediately see that looks pretty, right, and that shows the contrast and the resolution in the way that the human eye would want to see it, and we start moving to, well, actually what we get is some data, some numbers that go into an algorithm, and that algorithm tells us what we want to know, then that really opens up quite a lot of possibilities for how a microscope could be. We start to throw away a lot of our current limitations in terms of the fact that we have to have certain quality lenses in there, the fact that we have to have certain methods of producing contrast. And there have been some brilliant examples of that which have come forward in the last few years. There's using neural networks. It's possible to take an image from a holographic microscope. In fact, to take the hologram from a holographic microscope and to produce an image that looks almost exactly as though you'd taken that sample and you'd put it underneath a transmission microscope. There is work done where you take a low resolution microscope and you run it through, again, a neural network, and you produce an image which at least looks as if it was taken with a microscope which has much higher resolution. Now, there's some caveats about that, because it relies on some prior information, some guessing about the thing that you're looking at. But we're still in the early stages of that development, and it may get to the point where we don't really need to do that much work to actually build a microscope anymore. All the work goes into the computing, and we just need a very simple camera, and we'll basically have a microscope. And once we can do that, then the places where we can put the microscopes kind of grows exponentially, because a camera costs a few pounds and it can be extremely small.
That's fascinating. It always fascinates me how much we can do, and as you say, like portable devices, amount we can do in portable formats, and processing on go is always moving further. We've got one more question, but please do pop any more questions in if anyone has anything, which was around, more generally, actually, interested in how you got into this research field. So how did you start into this research field? What brought you here?
Oh, well, goodness, a bit of a roundabout way. So I studied physics. I then came to Kent to do my PhD with Professor Bardiani, who's another academic in the applied optics group, and he develops a technology called optical coherence tomography. So he works on this. So I did my PhD in that. I then spent 2 years in working in a hospital in medical physics, so working with sort of radiotherapy and nuclear medicine and radiography. I finally got into this field though when I moved to a centre at Imperial College that develops surgery systems for robotic surgery. Okay, so they develop robots basically for carrying out surgery, or they try to develop them. And they were interested in whether they could incorporate high resolution images into these robots, basically. So I was hired to see if I could come up with some ideas of how we could make miniature microscopes that would work with these robots, and that's really how I got interested in it. even though I'm sort of a physicist by background, I'm very much, I really enjoy building things and making things that work. And that's kind of my interest. And if I can combine a bit of the basic physics in it as well, that's kind of a bonus. But most of all, I like making things, and that's why this field really appeals to me, because we go in the lab and we build these instruments and we get to play around and do cool things with them.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Mike. Last question actually from me is, you've talked about where you think things might be, and you've talked about the fantastic work that you've been doing, but what do you think will drive us towards this kind of future direction for shrinking microscopy? Like, for example, you showed at the start, like a Zeiss or some kind of similar kind of microscope company. I assume they're still making those microscopes, right? Are they ever going to be investing in this kind of technology you're developing, or is it going to be driven by the medical field, as you've given an example, or is it going to be something else? What's going to drive this into the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. And of course, I've talked about lots of different things. So, there's a big difference between fiber microscopes and very, very low cost microscopes that you might want to use in the developing countries and low resource areas. That side of things, I think, is being developed by a combination of simply the fact that these things are needed and that the technology to do them has now become available. And that technology was not developed for this purpose, right? It's repurposing of AI, of cheap cameras, of 3D printing, and all these things, and bringing them together for this application. So it's a great example of where lots of things are developed for other applications, but then you realize, oh, well, great, we've got all this stuff now. We can do really exciting things with it. For medical applications, I think the thing that I'm kind of probably repeating myself a bit, but I think the thing that's really going to make a difference is the computing side of it, right? The ability to interpret these images in a way that is low cost and does not, if you could do this without having to involve a pathologist, right, then suddenly the cost effectiveness of these kind of things like shoots up, right? Because that's where a lot of the cost is. At the moment, we're not there, right? And fiber-based microscopes are not widely used for medical applications at all. And there are companies in this space trying to do it, but they're small companies trying to develop this technology at the moment. It hasn't really been picked up by the big players, as you mentioned. There's always going to be a market for the fanciest, biggest microscope, to sit in your lab that can do everything. We're probably never going to get to the point where I can, on my mobile phone, I can reproduce the kind of images that they get. But for a lot of applications, that doesn't matter. So it's about figuring out what you actually need for the thing you're trying to do. And in lots of cases, we probably don't need those huge microscopes. But there'll be cases where we do, and there'll always be money to be made by the companies making those microscopes.
Fair enough. I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much to the audience for listening and asking those questions. Thank you very much to Mike for spending the time talking to us on British Science Week. We've got some thank yous coming on in the chat. Please do, for those who are here, please go back to the Eventbrite and look at the rest of the events we've got coming this week. Mike will also be joining us on Wednesday for the roundtable, I believe. So where we'll be, all of the academics throughout the week, we'll be talking more about a more central conversation about their visions of the future. So please sign up for that as well. And that's it for us. So thank you very much to Mike, and thank you very much to you for listening. Have a lovely evening, people, and hopefully see you tomorrow.